What if everything you thought you knew about the music mogul known as Diddy was suddenly flipped upside down? What if behind the fame, fortune, and flawless suits, there was a courtroom drama so intense it shook the foundations of the entertainment world? Welcome to where we rip the velvet curtain off celebrity stories. And today we bring you the most gripping chapter yet in the Sean Combs criminal trial. As the jury prepares to deliberate, the defense unveils a closing argument. Picture from the one presented by federal prosecutors led by his main attorney, Mark Egner. The defense contends that the charges against Combs are nothing more than exaggerated tales, woven together by accusers with ulterior motives. They assert that Combs is a self-made black entrepreneur targeted for his success and misunderstood lifestyle, calling it a case of lies, money, and a rapper with a target on his back. This is a tale of two trials, one based on solid evidence and the other on speculation and hearsay, he emphasized. The videos, texts, and testimonies support their argument that what really occurred was consensual, framed later as criminal. The defense dissected the prosecution's accusations one by one, starting with sex trafficking. Claimed that just because someone consented once or twice does not make them a permanent participant in illegal acts. And more importantly, that consent did exist, he reminded the jury that the government has to prove only one instance, but even that has not been established with certainty in this case, especially when many of the so-called victims continued to engage with Combs willingly over long periods of time. Agnifilo described a lifestyle not of abuse but of alternative choices involving adults, where threesomes and hotel parties were simply and consistency of the witnesses saying that none of them ever outright declared. Part of a racketeering conspiracy which is necessary for the RICO charges. To stick, one of the boldest strategies by the defense was to show Combs as a leader and mentor to many in his circle, citing assistants and former employees who testified that he taught them work ethic and gave them opportunities they would not have had otherwise. Agnifilo challenged the prosecution's narrative by saying the government twisted ordinary business and personal behavior into criminal activity, like Combs using assistants for errands or security personnel managing sensitive tasks, somehow became sinister just because of his celebrity status, comparing it to other celebrities, like Beyonce using staff for similar duties. He addressed Cassie Ventura and Jane, the alleged victims in the sex trafficking charges, pointing out that Cassie herself once referred to the events as domestic violence, not trafficking. Agnifilo told the jury that doing something you are not fully comfortable with in a relationship does not equate to being trafficked. He stressed that both women were involved willingly, that they were not forced and had the freedom to leave, which Cassie eventually did. He even highlighted how Jane had a role in arranging escort sessions. Herself, the defense questioned the government's logic by asking if participating in 75 such events was okay, then why would number 76 suddenly become trafficking? And travel records, saying these do not prove intent and emotional complexity, not criminal enterprise. The defense touched on the role of other individuals alleged to be co-conspirators, like Fahim Muhammad and KK, arguing that they simply acted in professional capacities, until much later, sometimes years later, when civil suits were more likely to generate money for the accusers they accused. The prosecution of playing two emotions rather than presenting a clear case under the law. In the case of Cassie Ventura, even pointed out how surveillance footage was edited in a way that left out key moments, given it was not a criminal in the eyes of the law. The defense pointed to the lack of direct evidence. No one testified that Combs instructed them to commit a crime. No one said they were part of a criminal plan. Even his security team did what was expected for a celebrity of his stature, protecting him, managing environments, and carrying out legitimate duties. They stressed that Cassie and Jane were adults capable of making their own decisions, and that the prosecution was trying to reframe adult decisions as coercion without proper proof. The defense also argued that the government but are not labeled criminals. Agnifilo told the jury that the government only brought 2 escorts to testify, while many more were allegedly involved. If this was such a clear case of the key examples, and even highlighted inconsistencies in the accusers' stories and motives, with the stage set for deliberations, the defense closed with an emotional appeal, telling jurors that the government had overstepped, that they were trying to destroy a man not because of the law, but to uphold justice under the law, no matter how unpopular the verdict, of money and notoriety, but not because of guilt. They reminded the jury that doubt is enough to acquit, and that the government had not erased that doubt. Final moments of the Sean Combs trial carried a sharp shift in tone, as the prosecution rose one last time to deliver their rebuttal closing argument. Marin Kami, the lead federal prosecutor, did not waste of control, abuse, and manipulation that she argued defined the world Combs created. She claimed that the defense spent more energy in the government than explaining the evidence, and reminded jurors that in Combs' world the only rule was his desire and access to break down the independence and resistance of the women around him. Her voice rose as she argued that this case was not about consensual relationships, but about a man who demanded absolute control and punished any defiance. The prosecution emphasized the payments for sex, highlighting testimony from Daniel Phillip and other escorts who said that they were compensated and that there were explicit arrangements, even if those words were not always used in the texts. In messages, Kami stated that the defense was trying. The travel receipts, the voice notes, the surveillance footage, and the witness testimonies painted a clear picture of an organized system where Combs benefited from and orchestrated exploitative acts, and asked the jury why. Excused the behavior being described and said that celebrity does not put someone above the law when addressing the racketeering conspiracy count, which carried the most serious penalties. Kami pushed back on the defense claim that the government had failed to prove a coordinated criminal enterprise. She reminded the jury that the law does not require co-conspirators to come to court and admit guilt. She argued that actions speak louder than words, and that the pattern of coordination between assistants, security escorts, and travel arrangements made the case that this was an organized operation. She mentioned individuals like Christina Karoram and Troke, saying that even if they did not testify, their roles in the narrative were significant and supported the argument of a functioning criminal structure. She reminded the jury that RICO charges are not about isolated acts, but about consistent behavior over time, aimed at achieving illegal goals. And in her words, Combs' enterprise had one goal: to satisfy his appetite, regardless of consent. The prosecution then moved to address the kidnapping allegations, especially those involving Capricorn Clark and Cassie Ventura. In the 2011 incident with Clark, she emphasized how both Cassie and Kid Cudi testified that Clark was forced to participate in repeated lie detector sessions in an abandoned building, and that the presence of a gun was part of the intimidation. Kami argued that the defense excuse that she went home each day did not erase the coercion. She said that true fear does not always look like chains and locked doors, but can be emotional, psychological, and rooted in threats to livelihood and safety. She made the point that staying in a harmful environment does not equal consent, and that power dynamics often prevent victims from walking away. She brought up the arson involving Kid Cudi's car, saying that the defense focus on the glove and DNA was a red herring. Prosecution maintained that the fire was deliberately set using a Molotov cocktail, and that Cassie had warned that Combs had made threats beforehand. They pointed to photos, videos, and statements that supported this claim, and said that the act of revenge, emotional trigger, the romantic involvement between Cassie and Kid Cudi. Kami reminded the jury that the car was burned not by accident, but as a deliberate act of violence and intimidation. She continued with the drug allegations, saying that personal use was no excuse under federal law and distributed among others in connection with the events that formed the basis for the other charges. She listed substances like cocaine, ecstasy, and GHB as central elements of the nights in question, pointing out that assistants and staff facilitated the procurement and delivery of these substances for Combs and his guests. She stated, whether the drugs were bought for recreation or power play, the legal standard remained the same. It was distribution, and it was illegal on the charge of transportation to engage in prostitution. Kami addressed the defense argument that these encounters were private time, consensual adult entertainment. She argued that the repeated payments, travel records, hotel bookings, and coordination with escorts proved otherwise. She described the system as clinical, organized, and devoid of care for the people involved. She painted a picture of men and women being arranged like parts of a show designed solely to please one person, and that money was the ticket price. The prosecution leaned on emotional testimony from Cassie, Jane, and Mia, describing not just the acts themselves, but the aftermath, the fear, the regret, the damage. Kami noted that Cassie had already received a settlement, so she had no financial motive to lie. Jane never filed a lawsuit, and Mia had settled her own case years ago. She asked the jury what these women stood to gain from lying, and said that the only motive they had was to find one involving a hotel video where Combs was allegedly seen dragging and striking Cassie, and said that the defense ignored this clip because it was too damning to explain away. She argued that domestic violence is without consequence, that person will continue to do so until stopped or powerful, but whether the evidence showed that he used that power to break the law. She asked them to use common sense and to believe the women and hashtags were real people with real pain. Her final words, and manipulation, and that the law exists to protect those who, and that silence and power should not shield wrongdoing. As the courtroom settled into silence after her words, the weight of the decision was clear. The jury would begin deliberations Monday with everything they heard and saw over the course of the trial in their hands.